Hi folks, Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiatoria here. So a question that has come up a lot in the comments and even private messages as well from various of my viewers is what would be my perfect sword if I was designing a sword for today, for the modern day I suppose. What would be my ideal type of sword to carry around? And by and large I'm going to disappoint you here. And this is what the video is really about. I can't answer that question without context. That being, and I'm not going to belabor the word context, okay, I'm not going to over rely on it, but very simply, the type of sword that you would pick is dependent on a huge number of factors. For a start, is it something that you want to wear around all the time? Is it something you want to wear at your side in all kinds of daily situation, going to work, getting in and out of a car, travelling on trains, cycling on a bicycle, all those kind of things that you might need to do, eating, drinking, or indeed is it something that you can take on and off and you want to carry around with you in that sense, or is it something that you're going on an adventure or doing a zombie apocalypse kind of scenario with it? You know, kind of what is the situation that you're living in? Is it modern day? Is it some historical period? If so, which historical period? What type of place? What kind of environment? What kind of weather? Am I wearing it because I like to wear it, or am I wearing it because I'm seriously expecting to get attacked or have to use it? Do I think that I might have to fight in a war? Do I think that I might be fighting at sea or on land, or riding a horse, or driving a car, or walking on foot, or fighting in a forest or in a desert? Am I going to be carrying other things? For example, am I going to have shields or bucklers or revolvers? Is there going to be armour involved at any point? All of these things, and there are many, those are just some of the kind of headline examples that come straight immediately to mind. All of these things dictate what type of sword you choose, and very simply, if I'm in a sort of medieval environment where armour might be a factor, and where I very well might encounter pole weapons opposing me, or indeed I might be on a horse, I might be on foot, I might be able to carry a shield or a buckler with me if I'm not wearing armour, for example, then of course something like the good old medieval arming sword is pretty much where it's at. If I'm fighting in an environment where obviously I might be wearing gauntlets, then I don't need to worry so much about hand protection on the sword. Equally, if I'm using a shield or a buckler, I don't need to worry so much about hand protection on the sword, because having that thing in your other hand provides, generally speaking, enough protection with the sword, and it means I can move the sword into positions where they're what we would call quite wide spaced, and the fact that I'm occupying that central ground with a shield or a buckler means I can do that with the sword. If I'm holding the sword out in front of me and fencing in the modern mind's kind of idea of what fencing normally looks like, so you know, if we think about modern Olympic fencing, or indeed if you think about sabre and backsword and these kind of systems where the weapon's predominantly held out in front of you, then a medieval crossguard doesn't really cut the mustard, especially if I'm not wearing any kind of gauntlets. And so in that kind of situation, if I don't have, if I'm you know, dealing with unarmoured opponents and I'm generally speaking going to be holding the sword out in front of me, then clearly I want some form of hand protection like a sabre or a backsword has on it. Equally, of course, in ages when people wore swords a lot and occasionally used them for specific things such as duelling, then of course the small sword was very popular. The small sword, you can oppose other types of sword with it. It can fight against backsword to some degree. I would much rather have a backsword than a small sword. I know some small sworders who would probably vehemently disagree with that and say, oh no, the small sword can hold its own against the backsword. Fair enough, if that's what you think and you train small sword, then I trust your opinion on that. Personally, I would definitely choose a backsword over a small sword. However, if we make this bigger, heavier, bigger guard and longer, and with a blade that can cut to some degree, it becomes essentially a rapier. A rapier is a whole different kettle of fish, and yeah, absolutely, a rapier can hold its own against pretty much any other kind of sword. But the small sword, for example, is incredibly easy to wear because it's not very long, it is small, it's got a 30-inch blade usually, approximately, on it. It's got a relatively small hilt and it's light, it only weighs about 500 grams, about half a kilogram. So you can easily wear that all day and it doesn't really get in the way, it's not really a problem. And if you have to have a duel with someone, they will also have a small sword. So the fact that my weapon is light and I can only thrust with it and it's not particularly long doesn't matter, because they've got exactly the same kind of weapon. They also have a weapon that's light, not very long, and they can only thrust with it. So that's fine. All a duel has to be is two weapons of equal offensiveness and defensiveness. But if I'm for example carrying a pistol or a revolver around, then if I just grab one quickly, there we go. If I've got some kind of pistol around, so I've got something in my offhand, that might change what I have in this hand. For example, you know, a one-handed sword clearly makes more sense. If you're going to be doing things with the left hand, it could be holding a sword, holding a shield or a buckler, but of course equally if you're holding or operating firearms or other missile weapons or throwing things even, then a one-handed sword makes more sense. However, if I don't have access to shields or bucklers, or indeed missile weapons such as pistols and crossbows and things like that, then a longsword might make more sense. So there are so many parameters and variables to deciding which sword I would choose. And you know, I own in the region of about 100 swords, and I couldn't honestly say to you, you know, which sword I would pick, because it depends entirely on, I'm trying to avoid the favourite C word, but it depends entirely upon why I'm picking it. And you could say in a way that's why I have 100 swords, because I recognise that different swords are for different things. And even two swords that seem fundamentally similar, two types of sabre for example, can actually be different in purpose. One might be longer and heavier because it's intended for use on horseback. One might be slightly shorter and lighter because it's intended for use on foot. Slightly different types of sword for different types of purpose. So what I would pick would very much depend upon the parameters available to me, as much as I could know about those parameters at the given time when I was choosing that sword. But I will give a sort of answer, and usually for me it would be a sabre, because I like sabres a lot. When I say sabre, I mean a relatively straight bladed sabre that can cut and thrust and has hand protection. And you know what, I've spoken about this in previous videos, but a lot of swords fit into this same basic description, and for me that's almost the ultimate type of sword, is a sword that I can use in one hand, so it leaves my other hand free to do other things. So I can use it in one hand, it has hand protection of some kind, could be a Highland basket hilt, could be a sabre hilt, could be a side sword hilt of various kinds, or a schiavona or this type of thing, and has a blade that I can both cut and thrust with and is relatively light. I have fought with sabres against long swords and against rapiers and against small swords and against spears and against bayonets. I've fought with sabres against basically most types of hand weapon, and they're incredibly versatile. They're a really good middle ground. They, like I say, they can cut and thrust, they're relatively light, they're relatively quick, but they've still got a fair amount of cutting and thrusting potential, and they've got hand protection. But I'd be equally happy with a side sword or a back sword or a Highland broadsword, all of these kind of things. But just to caveat that with, if I knew I was going to be fighting in armour, I definitely wouldn't choose a sabre. If I was going to be fighting in armour, of course I would pick a very rigid and pointy type of sword, be it either one-handed like this arming sword, or hand and a half or two-handed like the long sword, because that's what they're for. So there we go folks, I hope that was relatively interesting. Cheers. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.